Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me for today's information session on the Stroke Survivor to Survivor, or the SS2S program. My name is Aurora Quigley, and I'm the Associate Portfolio Advisor for the American Stroke Association. In this information session, I'll go over some background of the SS2S program, a high-level overview of the roles and responsibilities of key players, and some important helpful information. I'll also play a short sample call so you can get a better idea of what the call experience would be like for volunteers and participants. If you have any questions along the way, the chat is disabled, so please enter them into the Q&A box. I'll do my best to answer all questions at the end. Also, please note that today's info session is being recorded and will be made available for later viewing on the SS2S webpage by the end of the month. We'll jump in by going over a little history of the SS2S program. Originally developed by stroke survivors empowering each other, the SS2S program is a telephone-based peer support program for the stroke survivors and their caregivers. Please note that throughout the session today and in our program materials, we often just use the term stroke survivor to describe the participant or the volunteer, but caregivers certainly are welcome in either role as well. The heavy lifting, the phone calls, are done by trained volunteers. The hospital offering the SS2S program will need an on-site coordinator to serve as a point of contact and oversee the volunteers, but once trained, most volunteers can implement the program fairly independently. SS2S is intentionally designed to try to rely heavily on the volunteers and have minimal involvement from the on-site coordinator. By having stroke survivors who have navigated at least part of their post-stroke journey provide support to newly discharged stroke survivors, SS2S aims to provide support, guidance, and encouragement. The volunteers are able to lend their supportive ear, help connect the new survivor to additional support, like your local stroke support group, and identify when more resources may be needed. The SS2S program is also a great opportunity for survivors to give back after their stroke and become even more engaged in their community. The two main roles that have responsibilities for implementing the SS2S program are the on-site coordinator and the volunteers. For the on-site coordinator, which I suspect many of you on today's call would serve in this role for your hospital, your primary duty is as the liaison to connect the key people involved. Since you likely know several stroke survivors from your hospital, you will also play an important role in identifying the right folks to invite to be SS2S volunteers. That said, you can also connect with anyone else who may have some good ideas, like social services, PTOT, or volunteer services staff members. It doesn't have to fall solely on your shoulders. We do recommend that you recruit at least 2 to 4 volunteers if possible, as we do consider it a best practice for teams of 2 volunteers to make the calls. With volunteers, we do recommend that they are at least a year and a half out from their stroke so that they are more likely to be at a more stable point in their post-stroke journey. Also, please keep in mind that since this is a peer-centered program, it is important that survivors or caregivers are the ones to make the calls instead of nurses or other hospital staff. That said, if the volunteers identify the new survivor needs additional follow-up with specific information or resources, of course, that is something that a nurse or social worker or other appropriate staff member can do. For training, we've actually recorded a training for you as the coordinator and a training that you can simply play for volunteers to help lighten the onboarding work. Please do keep in mind, though, that you will still need to make sure that if your hospital's volunteer services require any other trainings like HIPAA, you'll need to coordinate or lead those as well. Once volunteers are trained, you'll need to make sure that they have the necessary supplies like their sign-in sheets, call logs for notes, and access to a private space to make the phone calls. I also invite you to join me for a webinar, or a web call, I should say, every other month, where you can have the opportunity to connect directly with me and other on-site coordinators overseeing the implementation of SS2S from across the country. These calls would not be required, but rather will be offered as a support to help you share successes, navigate any challenges, and discuss best practices. And last, but definitely not least, you will need to enter data from the calls and send that to me at the end of each month. Please note that we at ASA do not want any personal health information for the participants. All of that will stay secure with you and your volunteers. The only information you will pass along to me will be aggregate information on calls made that month. On our previous call, many attendees were interested in previewing the data that would be involved as part of their process to secure approvals from their leadership. If you fall into this boat, please open up your Q&A box now and simply type in the word data. I'll get that and follow up with you via email after today's call with that information. Again, just type in the word data and I'll know exactly what you mean and get that over to you. If for any reason you have any issues using the Q&A box or you have additional questions, please feel free to email me instead at SS2S@heart.org. As I mentioned before, there will be trainings that all volunteers will need to complete to make sure we are all working from the same playbook using the same terminology, and so they can be sure to handle the new survivors' information with care. Beyond that, volunteers are expected to be supportive and honest with new survivors on the calls. You may ask volunteers to join and attend your hospital support group meetings if you'd like, since they will likely be inviting the new survivor to attend. Of course, it is entirely possible that they are already regular attendees, and that's where you recruited from in the first place. We also have forms for the volunteers to complete along the way to help them keep track of calls and their volunteer efforts. These will be passed along to you for the data entry I mentioned before. Again, to be as clear as I can, all of the forms and identifiable data that volunteers collect will be only internally used at your hospital. The only data that will be shared with me or anyone else at AHA will be aggregate, non-identifiable data. Finally, just like for the on-site coordinators, ASA will host a web call every other month for volunteers to participate in, and in order to give them an opportunity to give and receive support for their SS2S work. Again, these are not required, but volunteers may find them helpful. Now, to give you a better idea of how this might play out, I've got a short sample call for us to listen to. And just so you know what to expect, it's just under 6 minutes long.
Hello, Aurora. This is Sandy. I'm calling from the Stroke Survivor to Survivor program, the program you signed up to participate in when you left the hospital after your stroke. I'm a survivor like yourself, and I wanted to reach out to you and see how you're doing. So, how are things going for you?
I'm doing pretty well. Other than being so tired, I feel like I don't have any strength.
Oh, fatigue is very common. Good news is that it does improve. I remember the first months after my stroke, getting tired just walking to and from the mailbox at the end of our driveway. And now I'm up to walking 3 miles a day.
Oh, wow. Thank you. That is so good to hear. I'm trying to make little goals each day by increasing my activity.
That's a great plan. Good for you. Do you have any concerns about your physical functioning?
No, I think I'm doing okay with everything else.
Do you have any concerns with how your brain is working in terms of concentration or memory?
You know, it seems that if I try to concentrate, I get a headache. When I cook, I can't follow a recipe because I forget if I've added an ingredient. I've had to throw away a lot of food.
Oh, that sounds familiar. Someone suggested to me when cooking to put out all the ingredients on one side, and when I added them to put them on the other side, and that way I'd know if I included all the ingredients. I found that very helpful. Concentrating does get better. You have to remember that your body and brain just went through a significant event.
That's a great tip with the ingredients, and that's true about the concentrating. I do have to cut myself some slack.
Yeah. How are things going with your feelings and emotions?
There are some days I'm really down, but then, like you said, I realize I have to cut myself some slack. Overall, I think I'm doing okay.
How satisfied are you with your current situation and future prospects?
I'm doing fine.
How satisfied are you with your ability to carry out day-to-day activities?
I can cook, take care of myself, and get around without help, so I'm quite happy for that.
Yes, that is great. Overall, how satisfied are you with your personal and social life?
I'm so happy to be around friends, but I get foggy and overstimulated in groups.
Oh, I do know what you mean. I have similar experiences. I find that if we can be in an open area where there is more distance between other groups, I am able to hear without concentrating so hard. I have a secret code with my husband as well, that if I nod at him and casually point my head toward the door, he knows it's time for us to leave. We can just casually slip out and no one knows what's happening. It does get better. Concentration does improve.
That's a great tip. I'll have to try that.
Do you have any other questions or concerns about your recovery that I might be able to help you with today?
Mm, I don't think so.
Okay. If any concerns do come up, the American Stroke Association's website at stroke.org has lots of great information for stroke survivors. We also want to invite you to attend our stroke support group. You'll meet others who are also working through the recovery. The group is also open to caregivers. It offers them support and a better understanding of what we go through. It meets the third Thursday of the month at 3 p.m. You should have information about it in the discharge folder to refer to. If you're having a stroke, it's critical that you get medical attention right away. So it's important for survivors and their families to know the warning signs of a stroke. Do you remember any of them?
I know it's fast. F is for face, that you should smile in the mirror and see if your face is equal. The A is for arms, and that if you hold them up, one shouldn't droop down. I don't remember the rest.
No problem. You're off to a great start. The S is for speech. If you have sudden trouble speaking or understanding what's being spoken to you. The T is for time, meaning it's time to call 911. The sooner you get medical attention, the better your outcome may be. I know firsthand how challenging navigating post-stroke recovery can be. I just wanted you to know that you don't have to go through this alone. Would you like us to call you again next month?
Yeah, I would love that. I feel so much better now that I've talked to you. Thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome. I enjoyed chatting with you too. I'll look forward to calling you next month.
Great, thanks. Bye.
Goodbye.
Hopefully that gives you a better idea of how a call could go. And the forms that the volunteers have to fill out during a call are really just notes pages with several prompts if the participant is not overly chatty. So now that you hopefully have a better idea of what the SS2S program is about and what is involved in the day-to-day of it, let's go over the important information for moving forward with it. SS2S has been implemented in a few hospitals in the Chicagoland area and North Dakota as part of an initial pilot. It is now entering an expanded pilot phase where we are planning to enroll a maximum of 50 hospitals. While much of the core of the program aligns with the initial pilot, forms and some procedures have been updated for the expanded pilot. For instance, the expanded pilot will involve the volunteers making a recommended 4 calls to the new survivors over a span of about 2 months, starting at about 2 weeks post-discharge. In the expanded pilot, we are also asking that you get moving on recruiting and training your volunteers, as well as enrolling participants as soon as possible, with the expanded pilot phase intending to last about a year, wrapping up by the end of next year. In the expanded pilot, we will also ask for your help in assessing the program. That will involve me getting feedback from you and your volunteers getting input from the participants after a bit of time has passed from their participation. With all of that in mind, I'm sure many of you will need to speak to your leadership before a decision can be made. So please keep in mind that we are hoping to enroll all of the participating hospitals in the expanded pilot by the end of the year. If, however, that doesn't align with your hospital's availability, please do reach out to me whenever you are interested and have the approval, and we can figure out what our options are at that point. Please keep in mind that it is being offered for free on a first come, first served basis, though, and spots are limited. Something to keep in mind is that we are implementing this expanded pilot as a proof of concept, if you will, to demonstrate that ASA can offer this program across the country without being intimately involved in its day-to-day implementation, while still being available in an ongoing support capacity. Also, since SS2S is still in a pilot phase, it is being offered at no charge to anyone involved. For full transparency, it is possible that there could be a cost down the line, but that is still to be determined and in no way would impact the expanded pilot. A few points to consider when making your decision about participation. The SS2S program is intended to help encourage increased adherence to medications and follow-up appointments by new survivors, since they have a fellow survivor calling to check in on them and help identify when additional resources may be needed. It is also a unique communication channel for your hospital, since it is a peer calling to check in on the survivor rather than a hospital staff member or authority figure of any sort. I will also mention that I've heard anecdotally that multiple hospitals have implemented it previously and have gone through accreditation or reaccreditation have had their reviewer look very favorably upon their engagement with the program. Just to be clear, though, this is an anecdotal information and in no way a guarantee or promise. So whenever you are ready to move forward and sign up for the program, be it now or in a few weeks' time, there is a form at the bottom of the stroke.org/SS2S page. Fill out the few basic questions that it asks, and we will follow up with you within 2 business days. As a reminder, today's session is being recorded and will be made available for later viewing on the SS2S webpage by the end of the month. Now that we've gone over the basics, I'll start working through the questions that you've all submitted. But first, I'll mention a couple of questions that we received during last week's info session and go over those answers in case you have those same questions. Since I mentioned that one of the goals of the SS2S program is to help connect survivors to resources such as support groups, I had several inquiries about the availability of resources that we at ASA might have to help support your support groups. And the answer is that we have several items to share. If you'd like to go ahead and type support group info or support groups in the Q&A box now, I'll be sure to follow up with you via email after the call. Again, if you would like to provide any more specific information or ask more questions regarding support groups, then please feel free to reach out via email as well with the email you see on your screen. To promote the program, in the manual, we do have a flyer that can be used, but keep in mind that this is not meant to recruit new stroke survivor participants from the general population, but rather it's supposed to be an opportunity to have an ongoing connection to your newly discharged patients. That said, we strongly recommend that the enrollment form be completed at the patient's discharge. A best practice is simply letting the patient know that you will enroll them in the program and they will receive a call in a couple of weeks to see how things are going, while of course still allowing them to opt out at that point or any other point along the way. Finally, one other question that was asked in the previous session was about how to count your hospitals if you're part of a multi-hospital system. The best answer I can give is if each hospital sees, treats, and discharges stroke patients, then each one could be their own individual site. If, however, say you're part of a system where as soon as stroke is suspected or diagnosed, you transfer the patient to a central hospital, maybe a comprehensive stroke center, then it would probably be best just to have the one hospital be the site that represents everyone. That said, if you have a unique situation where this doesn't give you good guidance on how to proceed, please feel free to reach out to me via email again at that SS2S@heart.org email. And I'll follow up with you and we can figure out what would be the best approach for your situation. So now to dive into your questions. First question I'm seeing here, do you have any guidance as to how you would identify stroke survivors to recruit as volunteers? So as I mentioned earlier in the call, I think that assuming you have a good support group in place, that could potentially be a really great place to potentially tap into and recruit your volunteers from. If for some reason you don't have an active support group going right now, be it COVID or just changes in your support group over the years, or maybe you're getting ready to start one, so you don't have that to pull from, a couple other options to consider would be, again, reaching out to the PTOT department. Maybe they have an ongoing stroke patient that they are working with to help them recover from their stroke. Another option would potentially be to reaching out to your volunteer services and see if maybe they already have a volunteer regularly helping out at the hospital who just happens to be a stroke survivor. If you maybe try those avenues and don't have success, please reach out to me. I am, again, happy to be here as that support, that resource for you, brainstorm ideas, share any other super insightful information that I learned along the way from other on-site coordinators as well. Okay. Next question I'm seeing says, this sample call seems to be scripted. Do you provide a rough script for these calls? So full disclosure, yes, that sample call was 100% scripted. I am not good at being an improv actor by any stretch of the imagination. So that was fully scripted, so we could kind of touch on the highlights that you would probably see in a short, simple call that could happen. Of course, calls could be much longer. That said, we do provide a suggested script for a phone call as well for leaving a voicemail in the program manual. That said, that is not a script that must be used. It is just a suggestion or to give the volunteer an idea of kind of talking points to use along the way. The other thing that will be provided is a call summary form, which touches on a lot of common post-stroke challenges, be it transportation issues, fatigue, mental health changes, and several others as well. On that form, those variety of issues are listed, and the volunteer could check them off or use those to prompt conversation if the survivor they're talking to is just, oh yeah, I'm fine, I'm good, I'm fine, and doesn't really provide any additional information. It could allow for the stroke survivor volunteer to kind of guide the conversation and maybe probe a little bit deeper. I will also mention, though, that these are really just guides, and by no way, in no stretch of the imagination, prescriptive that all calls must be done this exact way. And that's because we want to have a very natural and organic connection between the volunteer and the new survivor. And we also want them to be able to talk about what they need to be able to talk about naturally versus having anything very specific and stiff and not allow for any sort of connection. The next question I'm seeing here says, do you need to have a hospital support program, I'm assuming a stroke support group, in order for the SS2S program to be successful? And the answer to that would be no, you don't need to have that. Absolutely would be helpful. Obviously, it could be a great place for you to pull from for volunteers, but by no means is it required. I know a lot of support groups have kind of taken a hit with COVID and the ability to engage with each other in the public. So definitely understand if you don't have one in place for whatever reason. But I will say, this is just kind of a hypothesis on my end, but if you're able to be successful in implementing the SS2S program, it could be a really great way to get a support group going. You could encourage your volunteers to participate in it, as well as all of the new patients that are discharged from your hospital. And there may be a demand for it as that ongoing connection once the SS2S program involvement for those new patients concludes. I do see that quite a few of you requested information for the data and support group, so thank you for plugging that in. Again, if you have any more specific questions on that front and you'd like to follow up via email instead, I will ping you if you've put your name in the chat there that way, or sorry, the Q&A. But you also can email me directly at ss2s@heart.org. I've got a great question here about aphasia. What modifications, if any, are made for people with aphasia? So it is a telephone-based program. That's the way it's designed. I have had a couple of people inquire about possibly using Zoom or Teams or some other web video chat format. And the way the program is structured absolutely lends itself to phone calls or video calls. That said, we as far as implementation of the program have no restrictions against it. I would just ask that you let me know if that's the approach that your hospital is wanting to take, if you're wanting to do video calls instead. But it really would be a question for your hospital, potentially like your legal or your technology departments, to make sure that it's going to be compliant with whatever rules and regulations you have in place for securing patient data. But video calls could potentially be a great way to communicate for those with aphasia, because it can allow for additional gesturing. The other thing I'll mention is that we have the volunteer teams, potentially a survivor and her wife caregiver that's with her making the phone calls, for instance. They could be calling a survivor with aphasia and their caregiver. So you could potentially have 4 people on a phone call helping with caregivers, potentially helping overcome any challenges presented by aphasia. If you run into it where it's an ongoing issue and maybe the strategies that I've already mentioned are not sufficient, please let me know, and I would be happy to brainstorm with you and see if there's another approach that we might need to take, or see kind of what the best option would be there. Next question I'm seeing: if the hospital does not have survivors willing to participate, does ASA provide a survivor? And the answer to that would be no. This is something where we want to empower you with the resources that we have for the program, but it is something where we want you to be able to secure your own volunteers and have that connection with your community. That said, if you have a really hard time securing those volunteers, again, please reach out to me and I would be happy to see what I can do to help you troubleshoot, see if maybe we need to cast a more specific net or maybe a wider net to find the volunteers for you and find the right volunteers for you. Let's see. Next question. So would we have to attend a session to learn to train volunteers? If so, how long is the training? So like I mentioned on the call earlier, we do have 2 different training videos. One is going to be, I think they're both under 15 minutes. One is going to be for you as the on-site coordinator. It just kind of goes over the roles and responsibilities again, as well as some best practices. The volunteer training video that we have is, again, I think it's going to be just under 15 minutes. And that provides kind of some background on stroke, different types of stroke, as well as their role as the volunteer. So we can make sure, again, we're all using the same language and terminology. So with the length of the volunteer training, it is meant to just simply plug and play. You can then add in additional, since it is so short, it's something where you could add in any additional information specific for your hospital, be it HIPAA, any other volunteer rules, regulations that you guys may have to make it work best for your individual hospital's needs. Okay. So another question I'm seeing here, do we recruit volunteers first and then request to participate? The answer to that is you can really take it either way. I would actually encourage you to go ahead and reach out to me first by filling out, either emailing me if you have additional questions that you need answered, or if you're ready to move forward, go ahead and fill out that form at the bottom of the SS2S webpage, because we will then be able to connect with you, give you the resources like the more detailed descriptions and other materials that come in the program manual. But if you want to go ahead and get both balls moving at the same time, absolutely feel free to do that as well. You don't have to do one before the other. I would just encourage, my encouragement would be to sign up first though, just to make sure that you are securing your hospital spot as part of the expanded pilot. And then that was a 2-part question. They were asking if the caregiver could be on the call to help the survivor if necessary. And as I mentioned earlier, absolutely. That could be for either end of the call. For the volunteer team could be a survivor and their caregiver, or it could be a couple of survivors, but then the person or persons receiving the call could be just the survivor, just the caregiver, or the survivor and the caregiver together. So one of the questions I am seeing additional about the video calls option. We have not tried video calls at any of the initial pilot locations, but absolutely, if it aligns with your hospital's framework and rules, I am absolutely open to you exploring that with this expanded pilot. But please do make sure that you get all the necessary approvals on that end. Just know that everything as it's written is intended, and the way the program is structured is intended for phone calls. But since they function very similarly, with the exception of video versus strictly phone, it lends itself very nicely to that. So I would, like I said before, I would just ask that you let me know that your hospital is wanting to take a video call approach instead of a phone call approach. Next question I'm seeing, are you presuming that the volunteers come into the hospital to make the phone calls? Yes, that is a presumption of the program. We do know that this can be tricky because of COVID. Different hospitals across the country are at different points in their COVID journeys. and what that means as far as volunteers. But the presumption is largely because the volunteers will have patient data. They'll have names, phone numbers, personal information about that stroke survivor, be taking notes on that. And so we want to make sure that that information is secure. If your hospital has some approach that would allow that to happen without having the volunteers come in, that is absolutely something I am open to. But again, just let me know if y'all maybe have a slightly different approach where the volunteers don't need to make the calls from the hospitals. And I would be happy to make note of that for my personal information. But again, we just want to make sure that whatever approach you're taking is going to meet all of the requirements for your hospital, to make sure that that patient data does stay private and secure. All right, that looks like all of the questions I have at the moment. So again, if you think of something in 5 minutes or 5 days down the line, or even a few weeks, please feel free to reach out to me via the ss2s@heart.org email, and I will be happy to follow up with you. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.